Greetings and welcome back to PBH 275, Injury Prevention and Control. This video is part of a two-part series on occupational injuries, where this first part will cover history. We're going to cover occupational injuries a little bit differently than we cover any other topics in this course, because there's so much to cover. That's why it's being divided into two parts. This first part today is going to be strictly the history of occupational injury and illness knowledge, incidents, and controls, from the prehistoric times all the way to the modern era when the United States unfurled the William Steiger Occupational Safety and Health Act, which led to the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, and for the first time in our nation's history, the United States had baseline levels of workplace safety and health protection that applied in all states and territories. But it's a long journey to get from prehistoric times to 1970 when the OSHA Act came to be. But that's what we're going to cover today. I said that we were going to cover a lot of history in this lecture, and we're going to go very far back in history, even to what we call prehistory. When you hear the term prehistoric, that means the time of like the earliest humans, when there is no written record of what their lives are like. We have to rely on fossil records and other materials that were left behind by them in order to interpret what their lives were like. So when you hear the term prehistory or prehistoric, that's what we're talking about. Now, the earliest humans in this prehistoric time, they didn't really have what we would now consider to be occupations, but these were people who tended to congregate in family groups or clan groups, and in order to ensure the survival of the group, there would be tasks that were necessary for some people to do, and these tasks would be assigned based on seniority, based on relative skill level and perception of who was good at what. And so, while we don't have a written record of some of these early tasks, we have certainly some fossil and other records that kind of point to what life was like back then. We do know that the first attempts to do what we now call agriculture, meaning you can actually grow crops on a land where you are rather than having to consistently live a nomadic life and moving from place to place based on the seasons and the natural things that grow. The first evidence of agriculture goes back about 11,000 years ago to what's called the Stone Age, back when people were still using stone and bone tools in order to manipulate the land and do things like that. So that's about how far back the first, what we might consider to be occupations, go in terms of what the fossil record shows us. We also have, about 10,000 years ago, we see evidence that prehistoric man would quarry for flint. Now, flint is an interesting rock. You can make fire with it by striking it together. It produces sparks. You can also make weapons with it, which are handy for things such as hunting. So the evidence of quarrying for flint goes back about 10,000 years in the fossil record. But again, there was no interpretable or written record from the people of this time, so we don't really know the degree to which people were harmed by what we would consider to be their occupations, or the things they did for survival. Moving forward in the prehistoric time, we come to what's called the Bronze Age, which is roughly the years 3300 to 700 before the Common Era. This is when the early people developed the ability to smelt metals with lower melting points. In other words, to take a piece of ore that had a metal embedded within it, and with a relatively small fire, to be able to convert that into a useful metal, and then using that useful metal, in this case bronze, to create tools, art, and many other things that would help people. During the Bronze Age, we started to see, based on, again, fossil and debris records, the development of a more urban society. Societies were getting to a point where not everyone was responsible for basic hunting, gathering, or farming, or basically acquiring food so that the collective could survive. There were some people who were designated to do that, but there were other people who were developing other jobs to help the collective. And these new jobs that emerged, some of them include actually going underground, mining some of these low melting point metal ores. We're talking about going beyond just quarrying for flint in open pit mines and actually going underground to find these other metal ores. And eventually the same technology was applied to iron ore, which required higher temperatures in order to smelt it and recover the iron from it, but it was the same ideas. And so we started to have people doing mining as an occupation and also smelting. This is where you take the metal ore and expose it to heat so that you can, and through the process of heat and oxidation, you release the useful metal from that ore. And so we also started to see the development of designated people who were craftsmen and artisans, people who could take metals and glass and pottery and make useful products, or even just decorative products for the domicile. And as city-states were starting to emerge in this era, there was a greater need for defense of your city-state from other groups that might not have your best interests in mind or that might want to take what you have. And so soldiers and guards people became an occupation in this Bronze Age prehistoric time. The first known written record of occupational injuries actually was from the Bronze Age, and it's called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which was written around 1700 before Common Era. What this papyrus does is it tells us the story of some orthopedic injuries that, based on where the papyrus was found and the conditions that are being described, appear to be describing the orthopedic injuries from the construction of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. And again, this was special to be able to find a written record of this from going back that far in history. The truth is, most of the people who lived in this era, their lives went undocumented and their sufferings went undocumented. There were a lot of people during the Bronze Age who worked as potters and metallurgists, and based on what we know now about what chronic exposures to mercury, lead, arsenic, and many other substances can do to you in terms of, acute toxicity, but also, you know, central nervous system toxicity, we can imagine that the potters and metallurgists of the Bronze Age, whose lives otherwise went undocumented, must have suffered greatly from injuries from what they did. Some of them probably, died very young and probably had some neurological and behavioral disorders for the latter years of their life. And some of the fossil record verifies this as well. A lot of the people who lived during this time, based on looking at the remains, it appears that they died very young. Another sad truth of this Bronze Age, which continued on for many centuries, is that a lot of the most hazardous tasks were performed involuntarily by people who were enslaved, by people who were captured from other city-states or other groups that were maybe in conflict with what was the dominant group. And so the people who were involuntarily given tests to do dangerous work, they suffered greatly and lived short lives, and this is borne by the fossil record. What we know is that a lot of people who were sent underground to mine metal ores were not doing it voluntarily, and they suffered from severe pulmonary disease, and based on the fossil records, it appears they lived very short lives. We also know from the people who were buried on site near the Great Pyramids of Giza that many of the people who were responsible who actually did the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, they suffered from extensive broken bones and also poorly set bones. So there was a lot of suffering there as well. The truth is, in this era, and it extended for many centuries forward, people didn't put together this idea that it was hazardous conditions that were causing this suffering and death. There was still a widespread belief that continued on for many centuries that if you sent people underground to mine for ore or whatever it is, and they died very shortly afterward, it wasn't because of conditions. It was because of poor moral fiber, sin, other things, and especially when you have people were who were enslaved doing this work, there was not a very high regard for their safety and health, and it took many centuries later for the connection to really be made that, hey, wait a second, it's hazardous conditions, not moral defect, that's causing these horrible injuries, illnesses, and premature deaths. So this lecture is going to largely focus on what we would consider to be Western cultures, meaning the cultures that came from Europe and the Middle East and West Asia, and then subsequently into North America and specifically the United States. Doesn't mean that other cultures were not important. It's just that Western cultures are where, here in the United States, where we got a lot of the attitudes about work and well-being and occupational safety and health. And, of course, a lot of that came directly from the fact that these were the cultures that colonized the United States, several centuries ago. And so we're going to talk about these cultures a little bit more. We're going to start with what's called the Greek era, which then sort of transitioned into the Roman era. And starting around the year 800 before Common Era is when the Greek era really began. And the Greek cultures were really good about documenting their lives, about what they did, why they did it, what was important to them. So we're really getting into a really big difference now in terms of the written record that exists, including the written record of occupational health and safety. What we know is that early Greek societies, the ones that started in around 800 BCE, is that they saw that people who did work, that they suffered, that they tended to live shorter lives, that they tended to live painful lives. And so for people who could afford it, early Greek society really tried to avoid work and sort of put work on other people. The fact is, in the early Greek era, is that a lot of the work that was necessary for the survival of the city-states was done by the enslaved, by people who were captured in wars and other conflicts, and then put involuntarily into tasks. Greek society did have free people who actually worked in manual labor voluntarily, people who chose to do work for a living. Those people were generally stigmatized by society and looked down upon a little bit, but yeah, that was the attitude that early Greek societies had about work, because they saw the negative health effects that it had on people. There's a quote attributed to Socrates that kind of talks a lot about the attitude that Greek society had toward work, and this is from Xenophon's Economicus. And the quote is, "Those arts that are called mechanical are spoken against everywhere and have quite plausibly come to a very bad reputation in the cities, for they utterly ruin the bodies of those who work at them. Lack of leisure to join in the concerns of friends and of the city is another condition of those that are called mechanical." So as you can see, this quote attributed to Socrates really describes well how Greek societies thought that if you had to work, that it meant that you were not able to participate in the things that were more important in their society. So one thing that started to happen during the Greek era, and certainly as it transitioned into the Roman era that came afterward, is that there were several advances that occurred in medicine and also some advances in occupational injury knowledge about what causes occupational injuries and maybe even some ways to possibly prevent occupational injuries from occurring, and advances in occupational medicine. The problem is that very little of this knowledge was actually applied preventively to protect workers. This was still an era where workers were considered disposable. A lot of the people that were doing the most dangerous work were prisoners or enslaved persons or people who were voluntarily working for a living, but who were kind of looked down upon by the elites of society because they had to work for a living. So it was just not a progressive era at all for safety and health being applied to workers. One very interesting voice in the wilderness was Pliny the Elder. This was during the Roman era. He lived from roughly the years 23 to 79 Common Era. He documented and noted the hazards faced by silver miners. He saw the people who went underground to mine silver. He saw that some of the conditions that they faced and the fact that they developed respiratory problems and lived very short and painful lives. And he correctly identified that it's not because of poor moral fiber, it's because of something underground, some hazards they're facing underground. So he recommended a very crude early form of personal protective equipment for silver miners, which would be animal bladders, to put an animal bladder over your face as a very crude respirator before going underground. And yeah, it turns out the silver miners who wore these animal bladders, they actually survived a little bit longer. They lived a little bit longer. It was still a very dangerous job, and they still got that's still not an ideal respirator, so most of them still died prematurely. But this was early evidence that personal protective equipment and addressing conditions might actually improve outcomes for workers. So again, even if it wasn't super effective, it was an interesting and important milestone. A lot of what we know from the early Roman era about occupational injuries actually comes from the writing of Galen, who was the orthopedic surgeon and physician for the gladiators in the court of Marcus Aurelius. And obviously, the gladiators who performed their gladiatorial contests and survived them often had a lot of orthopedic injuries they had to recover from. And so a lot of his writings describe the treatment of them and some of the ways to rehabilitate them. Of course, there wasn't any preventive strategies. That was not something that was applied at the time, but for these interesting writings of how he treated the gladiators kind of shaped some of our early knowledge of not necessarily prevention of occupational injuries, but certainly treatment of them and gain of function. Eventually, the Roman Empire fell, and in the European part of what the former Roman Empire, the early Middle Ages were a pretty difficult time. It's now referred to as the Dark Ages. This was an interesting time when basically all forms of health, public health, medicine, and occupational health, all took a step back for various reasons. One of them being that after the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe, the people started to adapt an interesting mix of both Christian and pagan traditions that resulted in some widespread cultural beliefs that, among others of these beliefs, was that the spirit was a lot more important than the body. In fact, the body is just an unimportant earthen vessel to kind of be discarded or not thought of. That the health of your spirit was more important than anything else. And a much stronger reiteration of this idea that if you suffered an injury or a disease, it was because of sin and that you were being punished by this injury or this disease. I mean, that kind of thinking existed even before the Middle Ages, but it really became much more predominant in this era. The idea was that if you got injured or got a disease, that you should pray, that you should seek penitence, and that should be your treatment. That any medicine that is sought after would have to be guided by church doctrine. If you went outside of church doctrinal beliefs in medicine, or certainly into any preventive strategies, that you were interfering with God's will. And again, this was only happening in the European portion of the former Roman Empire, but it was a very rough time. So the Middle Ages, from roughly the years 500 to 1100, was a very bad time for public health in Europe. It wasn't necessarily the case in other parts of the world, including other parts of the former Roman Empire. The Middle East was not going through a dark ages at all at this time. Instead, what was happening was that some of the Islamic cultures that had conquered this part of the former Roman Empire, they had been closely studying the Greek and Roman teachings in health for many years and had adopted them. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, these cultures actually built upon these Greek and Roman teachings in health. They didn't go backwards in time and start thinking about the importance of the spirit and the unimportance of the body and sort of pushing back their public health and occupational health and medicine knowledge. They kept advancing it. One great example of this from the Middle Ages, from the Middle East, is Razis. He was a Persian physician who lived from roughly 850 to 923. And he was a pediatrician as well. He was one of the first people to actually practice and recognize that children had different medical needs compared to adults. They had different physiologies and things like that. And so he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And one of the most important ways that Razis was ahead of his time is that in all of his medical cases, he started including statements of occupation, of what the person did for a living. This was very important because later on, we could look back on these records and see that, oh, okay, people that did this certain task tended to suffer more from these types of injuries or illnesses compared to people who did not. And again, It seems so intuitive now, but at the time this was revolutionary. Razis was also ahead of his time because he advocated in his writings for the ethical treatment of workers. He recognized the importance of workers to a functioning, good society, kind of pushing back against the predominant thoughts across many cultures that workers were disposable, that workers were not important. He actually thought that no, workers were very important to society and should be treated well and ethically. This is why, even though we'll talk about Ramazzini in a little bit more detail later on as the father of occupational medicine, I think a strong argument can be made that Razis might be the true father of occupational medicine. We don't have time to talk about every culture and the contributions that they might have made to occupational injury prevention and treatment, but I will briefly talk about some knowledge that came from the Far East that actually still exists to this day and is still effective, and that would be traditional Chinese medicine that is still to this day used for treating injuries, including on-the-job injuries. Things like acupuncture, tai chi, special types of massage such as Tui Na, and also certain kinds of herbs. This just because the Middle Ages were a difficult time in Europe does not mean that other cultures in other parts of the world were not continuing to advance public health, medicine, and occupational health and safety knowledge. They were. Very slowly, and starting in the 1200s to around the year 1300, Europe started to pull itself out of the Middle Ages and into what's now known as the Renaissance era. There became a new recognition of occupational injuries and occupational diseases, not just what they were, but also that it's important to prevent them. Part of the reason this occurred is that international commerce, as Europe transitioned out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, became much more of a thing. And with this blooming of international commerce came a new respect for work and for skilled tradespeople. Sort of this idea reemerged. It's really important to have somebody that knows how to build windows and forge tools and mine and smelt important metals. There was still plenty of social stratification. There still were certainly jobs that were reserved for the people at the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, and in some cases still by prisoners and enslaved persons. But it was starting to change a little bit at least. One interesting character from the Renaissance era was Georgius Bauer, who is better known as Agricola. And Agricola was very ahead of his time in a lot of ways. In his writings, he advocated for, the improvement of working conditions in mines, again, building on some of the earlier work from Pliny the Elder and from Rhazes and some other people that maybe people that were going into mines were dying because of conditions. And so he advocated for improvements to ventilation of mines, actually using some bellows to blow air into mine shafts so that the stale air problems and the dust exposure problems would be lessened. He also advocated for early personal protective equipment, such as wearing leather boots and gloves during certain tests, such as mining. He also advocated for cloth veils to be worn by people who were going underground to mine, because he recognized that dust inhalation was what was actually causing the respiratory conditions. This was certainly a evolution of what 14 centuries earlier, what Pliny the Elder had recommended when he recommended animal bladders over the faces of silver miners. Agricola went even farther than that. He talked about preventing other types of injuries, such as injuries to joints, what we now would consider orthopedic or ergonomic injuries. He also talked about how to protect yourself against physical hazards on the job, such as falling off of ladders, or how to shore the walls of mine shafts so that they don't cave in, because that was the cause of a lot of deaths. Certainly the bad air, but also like mechanical cave-ins. What's interesting is he wrote a whole book on metal mining. It was called De Re Metallica. It was written in Latin. And in that book, he talked about mining, and here's what he said. Again, translated from the original Latin. There is no compensation which should be thought great enough to equalize the extreme dangers to safety and life. In other words, Agricola was arguing that mining is so inherently dangerous that really no people should do it at all, because it was essentially a death sentence to be sent down into the mines. This is something that I would argue in the modern era we still struggle with. There's a lot of things, tasks, work tasks and other tasks that are deemed to be very important for the betterment of society, but they're incredibly dangerous. And people are assigned to do these tasks. And so it's a we're going to wrestle with that existential question a little bit later in this lecture, and really throughout the semester of are some things so inherently hazardous that people should not do them at all? I mean, Agricola thought so. Some of the written works of the Renaissance period are where we start to see the emergence of what we call the dose-response relationship in occupational health and safety, and really in medicine. And the dose-response relationship concept being the idea that the more you are exposed to a hazard, the greater the likelihood that you're going to get the injury, disease, or other negative outcome associated with that hazard. It's a very fundamental concept, but it was something that was not necessarily recognized and certainly not written about very much until the Renaissance era. Probably the most famous proponent of this was Paracelsus. Those of you that have taken toxicology courses in the past were going to be familiar with this name. And Paracelsus is the person who first wrote the concept, translated from the original Latin, the dose makes the poison. That basically everything can be a poison, it depends on the dose. Now, with that being said, the mechanisms of occupational disease states were still not very well known, at least not until the latter part of the Renaissance era, when van Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope, and we started to see things at a cellular level. We just knew that certain negative exposures led to certain negative outcomes, and there was a very strong correlation between the two. This is important because this was, again, that slow recognition that was so painfully slow to occur in the West that injuries and illnesses of workers were not due to moral defect. It was due to hazardous conditions under which people worked. Seems so fundamental now, but at the time it was still kind of a revolutionary idea. One of the most important figures in the realm of occupational health and safety in the West was born and lived during the Renaissance era, and that was Dr. Bernardino Ramazzini. He was an Italian physician who is widely regarded as a father of occupational medicine. Now, as I talked about earlier, I think that maybe Razis, who lived 800 years before Dr. Ramazzini, could also lay claim to that title. But Dr. Ramazzini definitely took things much farther than they'd ever gone. He directly observed workers. I mean, worker safety and health was pretty much all that he did. He would directly observe workers, he would note the unsafe and unhealthy conditions under which people worked, and he would draw inferences about causative factors based on his own direct observations of workers. So it wasn't just relying on what workers told him when they came to see him in his office. So this was a very important next step. And what Dr. Ramazzini did was he wrote his impressions, his inferences, into a book called De Morbis Artificem Diatriba. It was written in Latin. That title roughly translates to Diseases of Workers. And in this book, which was written in the year 1700, Dr. Ramazzini, recognized all sorts of chemical, physical, and even ergonomic hazards that occur with various job tasks. He recognized them. He wrote up control measures that he recommended, again, based on his own observations and inferences. And also, like sort of like Razis 800 years earlier, his writing emphasized the importance of workers to a society and the dignity of work. This was something that in the Western world had kind of gotten lost during the Middle Ages, but he kind of picked that back up from Razis and wrote about it. And this was very important for sort of changing the mindset that people had about work and about the injuries and illnesses that occur at work. Here's an example of a couple notable quotes from Dr. Ramazzini, again translated from the original Latin. To the questions that are asked of patients by physicians, that are recommended by Hippocrates, should be asked one more. What is your occupation? And one source of occupational disease is certain violent and irregular motions and unnatural postures of the body, by reason of which the natural structure of the vital machine is so impaired that serious disease gradually developed therefrom. So, again, Dr. Ramazzini was recognizing ergonomic and orthopedic risk factors. And the risk factors of repetition and static postures at work three centuries ago. Many or most of you are public health majors, and in the course of your studies, you learned about the person who's widely perceived to be the founder of epidemiology as a discipline and as a way of solving public health problems, and that would be Sir John Snow, who in the mid 1850s halted a cholera outbreak in Westminster, London, by recognizing that there was something in the water coming from a particular well, and you know, took care of that and halted the epidemic. So yes, the work of Sir John Snow is very important, but there was another Englishman who lived roughly a century before Sir John Snow who had also a very large role to play in epidemiology, particularly environmental and occupational epidemiology, and that would be Dr. Percival Pott. And what Dr. Pott noticed was that there was a high rate of scrotal cancer in English chimney sweeps. So in this case, the scrotal cancer, what we're talking about is squamous cell carcinoma, specifically in the scrotal area of young men and boys who worked as chimney sweeps. This was a very dirty job from this era where these young men and boys would have to squeeze into chimneys and flues and clean out all these incomplete combustion products that build up on the inside of the chimneys. Because if you don't clean that out, that can cause fires. It can burn down the whole building. But these young men and boys were coming down with high rates of scrotal cancer. What Dr. Pott noticed was that these patients would have a lot of soot from the chimneys accumulating in the scrotal folds. He identified that as the likely agent of the cancer, and he published his findings, and his findings looked pretty definitive, actually. He actually successfully identified the causative factor of this squamous cell carcinoma among chimney sweeps before anybody even knew what the specific carcinogen was. These days we know that it was benzoate-pyrene, a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon that's a product of incomplete combustion. But at the time, all that Dr. Pott knew was that it was something in the soot, and that was enough to recommend certain hygiene measures be taken that greatly reduced the risk of squamous cell carcinoma among chimney sweeps. This was the first known published link between occupational exposures and cancer, so I'm not trying to take anything away from Sir John Snow and his important work nearly a century later, but Dr. Percival Pott also was an incredibly important founder of the discipline of epidemiology. Now we will shift our attention to the United States of America, which the version of the United States of America that as we know it didn't really exist until the tail end of the Renaissance era and was largely driven by colonists from what we now call the Old World coming to North America and Central and South America. Of course, it needs to be said before we talk about the colonists and the colonies that there were people here before colonization. The indigenous peoples of the Americas did not have what we consider to be an industrial society. They had societies that were largely agrarian, that had specific tasks that people were assigned to do, things like hunting, weaving, growing corn, building structures, things like that. But it wasn't what we consider to be an industrial society for the most part. And when people suffered injuries during their tasks, there would be medicine men who could treat those injuries. And that's how sort of the indigenous populations did things, and that's how some of them still do it to this day. Now again, during the tail end of the Renaissance is when a lot of colonial projects that involved moving people into what we now know as the United States and Canada and Mexico first began to happen. And the American British colonies, which were mostly in the eastern United States and Canada, were created to support the crown with agricultural products because the east coast of the U.S. in particular had a different climate than the British Isles and some of the other territories that the crown held at the time. So there's certain types of agricultural products that grew really well in the United States. Well, what we now know as the United States, what was then known as the colonies. There were some rules that were established for these crown chartered colonies. One of the big rules was that these chartered colonies were not permitted to have heavy industries. They couldn't compete with the home region. In other words, if you wanted to start an officially chartered colony in Boston or New York or Charleston, South Carolina, or anywhere like that, you couldn't, for example, start up a steel mill and compete with the steel mills of Birmingham or some of the other steel mills located in England, Scotland, or other places in the Old World. That was just one of the rules that came with being given a charter and a stipend to start a colony in the New World. So these American colonies had a lot of very basic industries and also a lot of agriculture because that was the main thing that they could grow that would support the crown. The way that these basic industries and agricultural infrastructures were built was first it was on the backs of what we call indentured laborers. These are people who were given passage across the Atlantic in exchange for usually it would be like 7 years of service to the colony, in relatively difficult agricultural work, for example. And you wouldn't earn your freedom and your opportunity to, escape from this indentured labor until you'd served your entire term. Unfortunately, there was not enough indentured labor to really make particularly the agricultural infrastructure work, and so a very tragic and inexcusable decision was made by these colonies really starting around the year 1619. The decision was to bring in enslaved persons from West and Central Africa to be the labor force for particularly the commodity crop plantations in the southern colonies. And the public health implications of this inexcusable decision are still being felt to this day. But the enslaved persons from Africa didn't just work in the southern colonies on commodity crop plantations. There actually were some who worked in the northern colonies as well as machine laborers, as craftsmen, as dock and shipyard workers. So a lot of the colonies were, and then the early United States was built on the backs of enslaved persons, and that's a horrible legacy that we are still trying to grapple with in the present day. As some of these crown colonies started to mature and become more established, some of them started to sort of covertly build a substantial manufacturing sector, an industrial sector, even though their charter from the crown had expressly told them not to do that. Part of this was that there was still a need for a lot of materials and things like that they were having to import, often with a substantial tariff associated with that, from the Old World. And the thought was it would be a lot cheaper to make this ourselves. So even though this was being done in direct defiance of the crown, some of these early American colonies started making their own things, building their own things in defiance of that charter. So what happened is that this industrialization occurred. One of the major things that happened is that a lot of people started migrating to the cities on the East Coast where these industrial jobs were available. In fact, a substantial number of people who had been indentured laborers who had come across the Atlantic, served their 7-year time doing the work, and then been freed, had bought some land out in the country, and were making a living with subsistence agriculture. They decided for themselves that it might be easier just to sell and move back into the cities and take some of these industrial jobs now. And so there was a rapid migration from rural to urban areas at this time. So what happened when you have rapid industrialization and rapid growth of a workforce, in this case both from immigrants and also from people who had been here before, sort of choosing this type of work over, for example, subsistence agriculture, is that you wind up with a lot of disempowered workers and a culture that encourages very little regard for workplace safety and health. I mean, first of all, it needs to be said that a lot of the things that were being done in these colonies were being done by enslaved persons who had essentially no rights at all, and they were subjected to deplorable, inhumane conditions and punishments. But even for people who were not enslaved, for people who were technically free, the jobs were not very good. There was a near endless supply of immigrants to provide cheap, easily replaceable labor. So if you complained about a condition or if you got injured, there was a pretty good chance that you would be fired or turned away, and they would replace you with somebody else. And there were no rules at the time against child labor, so a lot of times children, very small children, would work in some of these dangerous factories. The poor working conditions were just considered the cost of doing business, and plus there was this widespread presumption that if you were not enslaved, work was a voluntary activity. And if you didn't like the conditions of the job, if you thought it was too hot, too noisy, too dangerous, you were free to leave and find other options if you couldn't handle the burdens that came with a particular job. Of course, this was more of an illusion of choice than a real choice, because any other place in some of these uh, rapidly populating cities that you try to get a job would probably be just as bad, would just have just as dangerous working conditions. So again, it wasn't really a choice. There were a lot of factors that contributed to the decision made by the American colonies to secede from the crown and declare their independence and then fight the Revolutionary War. There were many of them, but one of the biggest ones was undoubtedly that the crown continued to punish the colonies for their industrialization and for doing things in defiance of their charter and therefore in competition with the old world industries. So that would certainly play a role. After the American Revolution and independence, so basically from the late 1700s to the late 1800s, rapid industrialization continued for the first 100 years of the establishment of what we now know as the United States of America. And working conditions, yeah, they were pretty rough throughout this entire period. If we look at some of these pictures here, up on the upper right, we have a family of enslaved persons who are picking cotton, and undoubtedly in very, very hot and humid conditions based on the time of year when cotton is able to be picked. And that's the very definition of backbreaking labor because of how much bending over is required and how it's not as easy to pick cotton as you would imagine. It's a very difficult thing to do. And in the upper left, we have a picture inside a meatpacking plant from the mid 1800s. And what you can see is a lot of exposed belts and pulleys that, if you're not careful, could easily take off a hand or an arm. You would probably guess, and you would be correct, that besides all the physical dangers in this meatpacking plant, and probably the intense heat and all the other things, that the processes are probably not very sanitary, and the meat that's being packaged here is probably not very healthy and good for you. And again, that would be correct. In the lower left, we have a picture of a wool carding machine being operated by two very small children. And again, there was no rules against child labor at the time. And in fact, children were often sought out for certain tasks such as these because it was easier for them to operate some of these machines compared to a larger adult. But this is not at all an age-appropriate task for these children to be doing. And again, you see a belt and pulley that could very easily injure or kill a child. In fact, a lot of children were severely injured and killed doing age-inappropriate labor tasks during this 100 years after the Revolution. And in the lower right, we see a couple of men who are pouring some iron ingots, not really wearing much in terms of personal protective equipment, certainly no eye protection or face shields or anything like that to protect their eyes and neck and everything else in the event of metal splatter, which is a common thing that happens when you're pouring hot molten metal into cold molds. Again, this was just a time of not very much regard for safety and health in workplaces. So throughout the 1800s in the United States, rapid industrialization and urbanization continued, and as a result, a lot of people got injured and killed at work, and there was not much done about it. But around the year 1900, we get into the 20th century, workplace safety and health started to very slowly gain a bit of traction here in the United States. And one of the reasons it did was because of what was known as the muckraker journalists, people who wrote about the working conditions of the urban poor in some of the nation's most widely read magazines and brought these conditions to the nation's attention. One of the most famous of the muckrakers was Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book called The Jungle, in which he intended to inform people about the harsh working conditions and also issues of working class poverty where people who were trying to do the right thing and working a job were still in just abject, dire poverty. And the focus of his book was a meatpacking plant in Chicago. Now, what most people took from the book was not, rather than focusing so much on the horrible conditions of the people working, for the people working in the plant, they focused on the horrible conditions of the products that were being generated, like the just really, really gross conditions of meat packing itself and how just unwholesome and unsanitary the meat products were going to be based on the description of how they came to be. And it was suggested later on, it might have just been an anecdote, but it's been widely attributed to Upton Sinclair that he lamented later in his life that the way he wrote The Jungle, that he was aiming for people's hearts but hit their stomachs instead. Another one of the major muckraker journalists was Florence Kelley, who, in the course of her writing, documented the just horrible, grim, and grinding poverty realities of children and women who worked in sweatshops, what we sometimes call piece good shops, where you'd have to basically work yourself to death in order to make so many shirts or garments or other things per hour, and that basically the rate that you were supposed to work at was basically impossible to achieve, and the pay was deplorably low. And so people started to become aware of these as a result of journalists. Organized labor started to make some inroads in the US in the early 1900s as well. I mean, unions had existed before, but they were mostly sort of like for skilled artisans. They were like guilds and things like that, where people that were for specific certain tasks would have a collective or a guild or something like that, and they would have some organizing power. But what happened in the early 1900s was that organized labor began taking up for what we call wage workers, or what's sometimes unflatteringly called unskilled workers, meaning people who just go to a job and after a little bit of training, they do something that anybody else with a little bit of training would be able to do as well. And the international workers of the world started going into a lot of these factories where wage workers were and sort of organizing them and letting people know that collectively they could they could shut down the plant if some conditions that they found unacceptable were not addressed by management. So that was a big step. And then just a series of mass casualty workplace disasters occurred in the early 1900s that really shook not just workers but also the public out of the casual attitude that maybe existed for the entire history of the United States up to this point, that workplace injuries are just the cost of doing business. They're just kind of something that happens. There's not anything we can really prevent or anything we can do about it. Well, thankfully, that started to shift. While we cannot cover all of them, there are a few select incidents from the early 1900s I'm going to talk about now that really were high profile and really drove a lot of public sentiment for improving working conditions and doing something about it. One would be back in 1905 in Brockton, Massachusetts, the Grover's Shoe Factory disaster, where a boiler blew up in this factory, resulting in 58 fatalities. A lot of the laws that we have on the books to this day about boiler and pressure vessel inspections and safety actually are a direct result of the Grover's Shoe Factory disaster. In 1911, in Lower Manhattan, New York City, there was a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which resulted in 146 fatalities. What compounded the tragedy and why there were so many fatalities is that the owners of this factory had actually locked the exit doors because he suspected that people had been sneaking out some of the materials and actually sort of stealing from the employer. And so he took away the exit corridors. And so a lot of these people that died, because this was on the 11th floor of this building in Lower Manhattan, a lot of people, when the fire broke out, didn't want to burn to death, and so they jumped to their deaths. And as a result of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, New York City actually developed some standards and rules for inspection of buildings. They actually had hired some city inspectors to look into workplaces to make sure that these kind of dangerous and unacceptable conditions did not exist. This was before any state or even federal government actions for workplace safety had ever occurred. There were some in New York City as a direct result of Triangle Shirtwaist. There have been numerous mining and tunneling disasters, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, that really drove home the need to do something. Back in 1907 in West Virginia, the Monongah mining disaster was a series of explosions underground that led to 362 worker deaths. The what we now know as the Bureau of Mines, and later on, which included the Mine Safety and Health Administration, was actually born of the Monongah mining disaster. A somewhat slower moving disaster occurred in 1927, with what's collectively known as the Hawk's Nest incident, to which there have been at least 700 known fatalities that occurred. Again, I say slow moving because this was a disaster caused by silica exposures. There was a project to build some hydroelectric power on the New River near Gauley Bridge, West Virginia. In order to do that, they had to build a dam, but first they had to build some hydroelectric diversion tunnels. And the project to build these hydroelectric diversion tunnels on the New River there was a call out for workers, and most of the people that answered that call were actually migrant African American workers from the South coming up to West Virginia to work on this project. And unfortunately, the tunnels that they dug through the side walls of the New River went through rock that was almost entirely quartz silica. And acute silicosis is a very serious and very scary lung disease, and it ultimately claimed more than about 700 people who were not given any training, no personal protective equipment, no anything. They were just told to drill the tunnel through this quartz rock, and again, that was a major disaster. In the early 1900s, Dr. Alice Hamilton, who was a pioneer in the field of industrial hygiene, if you're wondering what industrial hygiene is, it's an art and science that deals with the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control of workplace health hazards. And Dr. Alice Hamilton explored and then wrote up, sort of like Dr. Ramazzini a couple centuries earlier, she wrote up a lot of the things that she saw, what she called the dangerous trades. One of the things that she published on that got a lot of popular press attention was a debilitating jawbone necrosis condition that was only found in a couple places in the U.S., places where people made matches and were exposed to high levels of white phosphorus. Well, what white phosphorus will do is it will replace the calcium in the bone matrix, particularly of the jaw, and lead to a condition called phossy jaw, where your jawbone disintegrates, and it's a very debilitating disorder. And so it got a lot of attention in the press. What also got a lot of attention in the press in the early 1900s was the plight of what was known as the radium girls. These were young women and even some girls who worked in these factories in Connecticut, New Jersey, and Illinois to paint watch dials and clock dials and instrument dials with this glow-in-the-dark paint that contained radium. And what these workers were told to do in order to not waste paint and make the cleanest lines was called lip dip the brushes, meaning after every brush stroke to sort of like put the brush back in your mouth and sort of tighten it up before you dipped it in the paint and made the next stroke. So what wound up happening to them is they ingested a lot of radium, which sort of like phosphorus, except that radium is also radioactive. It created a lot of debilitating conditions. It led to a lot of cancers. A lot of these radium girls, because again, they were almost all young women and girls that were working in these fields in the 1920s. A lot of them had very painful conditions and shortened lives, and their plight was written up in the press. There's actually a really fascinating book called The Radium Girls, written by Kate Moore. Back when I was teaching PBH 205, I used to assign this book to the students to read. It's still a very good book. It talks a lot about worker justice issues, about sexism, and about people who didn't have a lot of power actually coming together and ultimately getting some form of justice. It was kind of an inspiring story as well, even though what happened to the Radium Girls was an injustice and a tragedy, but some great improvements in workplace safety and health happened as a result of this. So in the early 1900s, there was still not any federal workplace safety and health standards, but the U.S. Department of Labor did start publishing lists of highly hazardous trades and occupational illnesses, again, building on the work of people such as Dr. Alice Hamilton. And a few states actually took some of this data, and based on the types of industries that were located within their state, they started developing industrial health units And they actually went out and started inspecting these places and enforcing very early versions of what we now know as workplace safety and health laws. Again, this was not uniform across the country, and it wasn't even uniform among particular states. It was just focused on a few states and a few what are designated as high hazard trades that have a lot of occupational injuries and illnesses. But this was still progress, and a lot of this, again, they used as a model some of the programs that New York City developed after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory disaster. Because of their importance in interstate commerce, mining and railroads were both targeted for new regulations to help make sure that wherever they existed in the U.S., that they would be operated safely and securely, and because, again, they were just so important for interstate commerce and national security. Another very important set of laws that happened in the 1900s was workers' compensation laws. And they were passed in every state in the Union between 1911, when Wisconsin enacted workers' compensation laws, and 1948, when Mississippi did. And the reason why workers' compensation laws were so important was because they kind of added some predictability and some no-fault elements to whenever a person gets injured on the job and is seeking compensation for it. Before the era of workers' compensation laws, if you believed that your employer was negligent and caused your injury, you would have to take them to court and pursue a tort claim. And then it would be a contest between you, who might not have a lot of resources, and the company, which can probably hire very good lawyers. And so the deck was always stacked. It was usually never a fair fight. It was hard to ever get justice that way. What workers' compensation systems do is companies pay into it's like an insurance system. They pay a little bit of money into it, and then in the event that a worker gets injured, there's a fixed amount that that worker is given. There's no need for anybody to file a tort or prove or go to court or anything like that. It's fixed, it's predictable, it's no fault, meaning that there's no attempt to assign blame to the worker or blame to the employer. It's just a much cleaner, easier, more just system. And now, what happens from workers' compensation laws is that you cannot sue an employer for getting injured on the job unless you can prove that there was like gross negligence, sort of beyond, beyond just normal, what we call negligence. Then you can sue outside the workers' compensation system. But otherwise, workers' compensation is kind of the sole remedy for compensation for workplace injuries. Around the year 1900, child labor started to fall out of favor because people started to rightly consider that children don't have the cognitive abilities and the experience to really safely do some of these dangerous work tasks. And besides that, it just seemed wrong that children should be, getting educated and learning, and sort of learning and letting their brains and bodies develop in a way that, and not be assigned completely inappropriate for their age, dangerous tasks. But it wasn't until 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act that child labor was finally completely eliminated in the United States, with very few exceptions for things like family farms and other things where people have to apply for work permits. So there was a lot of progress made in the 1900s, at least the first part of it, toward making workplaces safer. But then the Second World War broke out, and workplace safety and health kind of had to take a little bit of a pause because the emphasis had to be on producing as many materials to support the war effort as possible in the shortest amount of time possible. During the Second World War, there was a rapid industrial upswing to support the war effort, but that rapid industrial upswing did not stop after the end of the war and the armistice. In fact, it continued on. What was found was that a lot of the products that were developed from wartime research and development, particularly chemicals, that some of these products developed for wartime actually had civilian and peacetime uses. And so the production kept on going. Plus, there was more participation in the workforce at this time than there had ever been because there's more rural to urban migration. There's a lot of people who had not been drafted into the war, and certainly a lot of women who were not eligible to be drafted. They moved to urban areas to work in some of the areas to support the war effort. And then after the war ended, these jobs were still there. So lots of rural to urban migration, lots more people participating in the workforce, a lot more people working in manufacturing and heavy industry regions. And at this time, in the mid-1900s, there was still no uniform federal laws for workplace safety and health or for environmental protection. You still had some places, such as New York and Massachusetts, where there was a lot of inspections of workplaces going on, and where there was a lot of labor union activity and things like that. What happened after the war is that industries started to get drawn away from those areas and toward areas where there was not a lot of strong labor union representation, or where there was either weak or non-existent workplace safety and health and environmental protection laws. So this is kind of an era of a lot of inequality. It's sometimes called the era of smokestack chasing, where a lot of the most dangerous industries, the most polluting industries, the types of industries that are most likely to depress the property values of people that live around them, were preferentially going to places, particularly in the Deep South, particularly in neighborhoods where a lot of socioeconomically disadvantaged people, including a lot of minority populations, lived. A lot of these more noxious and dangerous work areas were going to these neighborhoods and creating higher levels of environmental hazards, making the air and the water outside of the factories unsafe to breathe. Certainly the jobs inside these places were also kind of dangerous. And again, as I talked about, diminished property values, because a lot of times when you relocate your place from a area with strong labor unions and strong workplace safety and health protections to a place that's not, that's just, it leads to a lot higher community allostatic load, depressed property values. These places cannot produce a NIMBY response, meaning not in my backyard, and so it leads to a lot of inequalities and injustices that we still see to the modern day. If you've ever traveled to Louisiana, particularly along the Mississippi River corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, you will see a lot of petrochemical plants like the one pictured here. And there's a reason why you'll see a lot of them. It's because what I was talking about before, the phenomenon of because there's no uniform baseline regulations for safety and health and environmental protection, at least there was not in the 1940s and 50s when a lot of these plants were built, they all went to areas like this where there were weak labor laws, weak environmental and workplace protection laws, and where there was disadvantaged people, a large African American population, and that was promised, we'll bring jobs. And the community was willing to accept this opportunity to have more jobs, even though the jobs that were coming were not particularly good jobs, and these jobs were going to pollute the environment and depress their property values. I mean, this is exactly what you see even to the modern day, and this is the consequence of not having uniform baseline federal regulations for these sort of things. It leads to unequal allostatic load, environmental injustices, and honestly, workplace safety and health injustices for many decades now, and including to the modern era, which I'll talk about later on. It's probably still safer to work in a factory in New York than it is a factory in Louisiana, even with modern occupational safety and health standards. I'll get into why later on. The late 1950s and pretty much the entirety of the 1960s was a time of large social movements, probably the most important and significant one being the Civil Rights Movement. But there were many other movements that went along with the Civil Rights Movement, and kind of some concurrent protests and movement as well for things like the environmental movement, which was spawned largely by the publication of Silent Spring in 1962, a book written by Rachel Carson that really made people aware of the effects of persistent organic pollutants, in this case the persistent organic pollutant being DDT, which was put down to try to control mosquito populations, but that was decimating California condor populations. There was an anti-war movement at the same time as well. People were fiercely debating whether the United States should be involved in a war in Vietnam. And many of these injustices that were occurring, including the injustices of the unequal burden of dangerous and polluting workplaces that I talked about earlier, were being brought into people's homes in a new way, this new medium called television. Homes were getting televisions in their house, and during the evening news that a lot of people were watching either during dinner or after dinner, people were learning about all these injustices, actually seeing moving pictures about it, which made a huge difference. So this was a time for a groundswell of a lot of support for making a better society. And there was a huge support support movement for laws that would make workplace safety and health protections mandatory in every state. The idea was we did not want to have the era of smokestack chasing anymore. We didn't want to have a race to the bottom where some states and regions, particularly in the Southeast, particularly ones with large disadvantaged and minority populations, sort of attracting and then drawing the most dangerous and most polluting industries. And so the Environmental Protection Agency was born of this era, and so was the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That administrative agency came into being with the passage of the William Steiger Occupational Safety and Health Act in the year 1970, which created two incredibly important agencies: OSHA within the Department of Labor, which would promulgate and enforce mandatory workplace safety and health standards for all industries in the United States, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which is the research arm that promoted and funded a lot of research for how to make workplaces safer and better. They were located in the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So as you can see, it was a long pathway to get uniform baseline regulations of workplaces in the United States. It took until the year 1970 for it to finally happen, thanks to the OSH Act and the administrative agency that came from it, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So we're going to talk about some of the major elements of these now. First, the General Duty Clause. What the OSH Act says is that every employer must furnish to each of its employees a workplace that is free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. The reason why this is called the General Duty Clause is because there are many specific OSHA standards for specific hazards, for construction hazards, for trenching and excavation hazards, for many specific things. But it's not always possible for an administrative agency to write a regulation that covers every single hazardous thing that can happen in a workplace. Well, that's what the General Duty Clause is for. If there is something happening in a workplace that there's not a specific OSHA regulation that says you're not permitted to do that, but it's something that is likely to cause death or serious physical harm, an employer can be cited and told they can't do that anymore because of the General Duty Clause. Another important element of OSHA is reporting requirements. If there's a fatality within a workplace, you have to notify your nearest OSHA office within 8 hours. This will often trigger an inspection. In fact, usually, the only time that doesn't is if it's something that does not appear to be completely work-related, like somebody maybe having a cardiac event at their desk or something like that. But those have to be reported immediately. If you have an incident at work that leads to an inpatient hospitalization, meaning somebody has to be admitted to a hospital due to this workplace injury, not just treated at ER and released or something like that, but actually admitted, you have to notify your nearest OSHA office within 24 hours. Any incident that involves amputation of any body part or loss of an eye has to be reported to your nearest OSHA office within 24 hours. Again, these usually will trigger an inspection. Plus, many employers, including employers with more than 10 employees and certain high-hazard industries, have to submit a summary of all their recordable injuries to the nearest OSHA office or to the Bureau of Labor Statistics on an annual basis. And again, they're using a form called the OSHA 301 form. This is where OSHA and the Bureau of Labor Statistics get a lot of our data about particular classifications of employers and who has the highest injury rates. So it's very important that employers that are covered under this honor this reporting requirement. Plus, you can be cited if you do not. So thank you for your time and attention today during this long walk through the history of occupational injuries. In next week's module will be part 2 of occupational injuries, where we'll talk about the epidemiology, prevention, and future challenges in occupational health and safety. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you.